Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. I'm Alec Pollard, coming to you live from Israel with the biggest stories in the region. Tensions between Jerusalem and Washington continue to grow over the future of Gaza. The White House is said to have delivered a sharp rebuke to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu following Israel's strike that killed senior Hamas commander Raad Saad, with U.S. officials claiming the attack violated the Gaza ceasefire. According to a report by Axios, American officials warned Netanyahu that the strike risked undermining President Donald Trump's role in brokering the deal. One official was quoted as saying Washington would not allow Israel to damage the president's reputation or the agreement. Asked about it in the White House, President Trump said this.
But was that a violation of the ceasefire, the strike on the Hamas general?
We're going to have to see. We're looking into that.
How soon do you expect that international stabilization force to be up and running in Gaza?
I think that it's, in a form, it's already running. In a very strong form, it's already. But it'll get stronger and stronger, and more countries are coming into it. They're already in, but they'll send any number of troops that I ask them to send. They want to see peace. We have more than 59 countries. We have many countries that aren't even in the Middle East, but they're fairly close to the Middle East. They want to be involved. So it's been pretty amazing.
Disagreements were also aired in Jerusalem during talks with U.S. envoy Thomas Barak concerning the Lebanese and Syrian fronts, and Jerusalem is reportedly up in arms over reports that the U.S. is now considering a sale of F-35 fighter jets to Qatar. To break this down, we now have Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch from the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, what should we read into this? This is a report that's coming from Axios regarding a possible, let's say, rebuke of the Trump administration to Netanyahu for conducting that strike in Gaza, breaking the ceasefire, so to speak. Israeli officials are saying it's Hamas who are breaking the ceasefire, and Israel is responding.
I think one of the problems that we've had all the way along since the ceasefire deal was really set forth to start with was that it was more of a Swiss cheese more than anything else, with more holes than necessarily than substance. The subject of disarming Hamas was always one of the stalwarts of that agreement. Hamas needs to disarm, needs to be disbanded, or otherwise it will just rebuild its power, reconstitute its forces, and again continue to pose a threat. And so this is something which we haven't seen much movement on, really the opposite. Since the ceasefire went into really into force, Israel has been providing the Gazan population with 600 trucks of aid every single day, going straight into the hands of Hamas, and which has really been reconstituting, rebuilding, and reestablishing itself. So that really hasn't been the case. We also saw the other elements of the ceasefire agreement, which included allowing the senior Hamas members to lay down their arms and then be given safe passage almost out of the Gaza Strip. What was Raad Saad still doing there in the Gaza Strip, reconstituting the Hamas terror forces, excuse me, to carry out the next attack? As Khaled Mashal has said, there will be another October 7. Just yesterday, Osama Hamdan, another senior member of Hamas, saying that we will continue on with our resistance, as they call it, and the efforts to murder Israelis and Jews. He said there's no Hamas leader, whether in private or in public, that regrets or even that doesn't agree with the October 7 massacre. So this is what we're dealing with. And to say that President Trump is going to say, well, it's only Israel that has a breach of the ceasefire, I don't think that's a real option that's on the table. I think it's possibly catering to the Qataris, to Erdogan, to the Turks, who are saying, well, you have to stop the Israelis from actually disarming Hamas. They are, Qatar and Turkey are Hamas's defenders.
So that raises a question. It raises a question regarding Trump's policy. We know that Trump says he likes Erdogan very much, for example. We know that he's in a good relationship with the Qataris. He wants to sell now F-35s potentially to the Qataris. Is this revealing the fact that it's unrealistic what Trump is trying to achieve by having the relationship with all of these contradicting powers in the Middle East, and that it means that the the international force stabilization plan that he said is coming along very well is not realistic? It can't progress in the current climate.
I think it's probably unreasonable to assume that there is any other force really on the globe that will take up arms to effectively and actively disarm Hamas. Gunfights, gun battles in Gaza Strip with these terrorists to disarm them. That is, I think, an unreasonable scenario that was part of this peace agreement this ceasefire agreement from the start. And I think that is, whilst President Trump may be presenting the positive side, well, there are lots of people who will send as many forces and as many troops as we want, or as many troops as he wants. I feel that we won't see any of that active fighting against Hamas, which is the only thing that will force them to disarm. And so we can talk about positive vibes and a positive environment, but what we actually need to see is action on the ground, Hamas being disarmed, Hamas being disbanded, and not being allowed to reform, reconstitute, and rearm itself.
So how should Israel navigate that? Because essentially what you're saying is Hamas is rearming, Trump is talking big, which is something that he's very good at doing, we know. But when it comes to action and actually doing it, only Israel can really disarm Hamas. But on the other hand, if Israel does take action, as it did against this Raad Saad, then it might get a rebuke from the U.S. and say, look, you're jeopardizing our plans.
So I think that what Israel needs to advocate for, it should have done the same with the Oslo Accords all the way back then in the 90s, to ensure strict adherence to the agreements signed. Hamas committed as part of the ceasefire agreement to disarm. The countries involved in that agreement, including Qatar and Turkey, agreed that they would assist in disarming Hamas. Israel must demand strict adherence to those provisions. In the same way as we have allowed the aid into Gaza, we have fulfilled our side of the agreement. There must be strict adherence on the other side. And once that starts to crack, once we allow the terrorists to dictate which provisions they will respect and which provisions they will blatantly flout, then we will see that this will not be the end of the conflict, but rather just another, albeit extended, flare-up in this continuing cycle of violence, and nothing will unfortunately have changed. That will be bad for the Palestinians, it will be bad for Israel, and it will be bad for the rest of the Middle East looking on to see, well, what resolve will actually win out? Will it be President Trump's resolve to disarm and defang the terrorists of the region, or will those terrorists prevail in dictating on what terms they are willing to continue fighting against Israel? So that's really the wider perspective of regional politics and diplomacy that we need to discuss. And everyone is watching. Who is going to blink first?
You mentioned the rest of the Middle East looking on. There was these talks with Thomas Barak, the U.S. envoy for Syria, about the situation in Syria and in Lebanon. What do you think Israel should be doing or pressuring or advocating for concerning the American involvement in trying to reach a more stable reality there in the northern front?
I think on all the different fronts, whether it be Hamas, whether it be Lebanon, whether it be Syria, it's going into these situations with your eyes wide open, understanding that none of these people are changing their minds. They're not changing their policies. They're far from becoming Zionists. Many of them are still fundamentalist jihadi supporters who have the sole goal of destroying Israel deep within their psyche and within their policies. And that's something which all of the policies need to understand and to dictate, that this isn't something that we're going to go into. So in the thought, in the aspiration that these people will at some later stage down the line maybe change their policies. Lebanon will not change as long as Lebanon is dominated by Hezbollah, by the Shiites, by Iran, directly and indirectly. Lebanon will unfortunately not change. Mahmoud Ashara is not becoming a Zionist. And that has to be understood, because if we delude ourselves now, willful blindness will not lead to any long-term stability, but will lead the entire region into another cycle of violence and ongoing violence, which is something which obviously is not good for any of us.
Well, that's also a question regarding You're talking about making sure agreements are enforced. There is the same question in Lebanon, Hezbollah not enforcing the agreement there, and Israel trying to make sure that area remains demilitarized. They had the same problem, Israel, after 2006. Everything south of the Litani was supposed to be free of Hezbollah forces, and that didn't happen. So it just seems like history is repeating itself, where we have these international forces that are condemning Israel for trying to enforce agreements, and then when those agreements aren't enforced, lo and behold, conflict erupts at some point later down the line.
The problem really starts where, and you described the situation very, very, very clearly and very exactly. Every time there's been an agreement, the terrorists don't meet their part in the agreement, and then Israel is vilified for enforcing the agreement. The problem starts when Israel shows the first level of flexibility. Well, we can possibly wax over this breach of the ceasefire agreement. Let's remind everyone, the first part of the ceasefire agreement was meant to be that within 72 hours, all of the hostages will be returned to Israel. The terrorists haven't even met that fundamental basic requirement. Ran Gvili is still being held by the genocidal terrorists in Gaza. They know exactly where he is. They are doing this in order to test our resolve, to test the resolve of the US, and for no other reason. And this should be and should have been the very basic demand. All of the terrorists, before anything else, all of the hostages be released in the same way as we released all of the terrorists. Only then can you discuss any further movement. And until they meet that requirement, then they are in constant breach of the ceasefire agreement. And this is what Israel should be saying, I believe, on every single forum, every single discussion. Hamas is in fundamental breach of the ceasefire agreement. And that is really something that needs to be dealt with by these other countries, all these other involved parties that have so much leverage. Erdogan, Turkey, has massive leverage over Hamas. As we know, Turkey is the home to hundreds of Hamas revenue developing companies. Without Turkey, Hamas loses a large portion of its investment, of its funds, and its ability to really operate. And that gives Erdogan a lot of leverage. He is refusing to use it. And President Trump needs to understand that, and Israel needs to call them out for that.
All right. Thank you also, Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch from the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, for that breakdown, and also mentioning, of course, Ran Gvili, who is the last Israeli hostage still in Gaza, meaning phase 1 of the agreement has not yet been implemented. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on now, it's been more than a year after it was filed that the International Criminal Court in The Hague rejected Israel's appeal against the arrest warrants issued for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, leaving them in effect. The decision, which passed by a now 3-2 vote in the ICC appeals chamber, is final. Israel's foreign ministry criticized the ruling, calling it politics disguised as international law, and accusing the ICC of disregarding the sovereign rights of non-party states, including Israel. Israel maintains it did not commit war crimes and insists the decision ignores its domestic investigations, undermining both Israel's sovereignty and the ICC's obligations under the Rome Statute. Robbie, Sabel, professor of international law at the Hebrew University, joins us now. Thank you for coming on. Can you explain what Israel's appeal was about, and did they give an argument for its rejection in the ICC?
Gil, as you pointed out, Israel is not a party to the court. By the way, neither is the United States. And we're put there by pretense that there's a Palestinian state which has control over the Gaza Strip. Clearly not true. But once they've decided that, under the statute of the court, every state is given an opportunity to investigate it itself. And Israel's appeal was, we were warned that there will be a discussion on the occupation and Israeli settlements, but there was no warning about the discussion of what they claim are war offenses in Gaza. we should have been given an opportunity to investigate it ourselves. And the appeal court decided no. The fact that they had warned us about the settlements was enough to cover the fact that they are claiming war crimes and we're not entitled to investigate it ourselves. It's relevant to point out that the decision was made by a majority of 3 against 2. In other words, there were 2 judges who completely accepted Israel's appeal. It's a blow, it's a procedural blow, not a substantive blow, but it certainly is a procedural blow to Israel's standing.
Right. So from what I understand, this was basically a pause on investigations of the ICC while the appeal was ongoing. And now that the appeal has been rejected, so they resume basically with the investigations into the war crimes?
Yes, Israel will still have an opportunity to claim, which I think is correct in law, that the court has no jurisdiction. It's questionable whether there's a Palestinian state, even more questionable whether they have control over Gaza. But whether the court will accept it, I'm not sure. The problem with all international tribunals is politics. The judges are appointed by states. States have their own foreign policy. It's not an impartial court. And we have to assume, and I regret it, that all international tribunals which are appointed by states are going to be controlled by politics. And I'm afraid this is what happened here and is likely to happen in the future as well.
So you say controlled by politics. Can you get into that a little bit? Like what politics, who? There's the prosecutor, Karim Khan, who's also had allegations, for example, of sexual harassment against him. What exactly do you think, some of those politics that are at play that led to this decision?
In other words, a judge has to be completely impartial. And when a judge is appointed by a state, there's always the possibility that he'll be influenced by the foreign policy of that particular state. Though many of the judges of the court are very fair, some are not. And we have to assume that on issues of Gaza, Israel-Palestinian, Israel is in a minority. We don't have political support of most states. United States, as you pointed out, is not a member. It cannot come to our defense there. Therefore, we're alone, and we're facing a court whose judges and prosecutors have been appointed by states, and we have to assume that not all of them will be impartial.
What do you make of Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC? Do you think he's impartial or not?
No, I don't think he is. I think he has his personal problems, which are not our things, but he wanted to get a Western democratic state. The accusations against the court have been, so far, they were only prosecuting third world states. And he felt he had an opportunity to get hold of a state that was democratic and, in his views, Western, and Israel was an obvious target. And I think that's what his aim was. And we have to assume the court will also be happy, if they can, to try and convict leaders of a democratic Western state to prove the, quote, impartiality of the court.
Right. So what are the implications for Netanyahu now that the arrest warrant is still in place against him? The investigation into the war crimes to actually not just have a warrant, but to convict will continue. What does that mean that Israel has a prime minister who has this cloud hanging over him?
We dispute the jurisdiction of the court, and we're going to claim it. And I don't know I hope the results, the court will accept it. If not, we will be faced with a possibility of prosecution. I mean, as yet, there's been no prosecution. There's a preliminary stage, but there is a possibility that they try and prosecute Israeli leaders. I hope and believe that most Western states won't accept the decision of the court, will not try and invest it. But we have to assume that there may be some states that will participate with the court and try and take action. But we're a long way from that. Again,
right, so
there's no prosecution yet. We're still at a very preliminary stage.
Right, so it is a long way from actually getting to a point where the court convicts of war crimes and so forth. But just the fact that this process is ongoing and it's going to drag out for a long time, that is going to be very bad for Israel. It's another example of these international institutions like the UN that have this fixation on Israel and give legitimacy to those who want to destroy Israel, who say, look, these international organizations are essentially saying that Israel is in the wrong.
I think to a certain extent, this was the objective of the Palestinians, perhaps of South Africa, simply to try and delegitimize Israel, even though they may assume that in the end the court cannot decide that their war crimes were committed. Nevertheless, in the meantime, they're smearing Israel's name, trying to delegitimize our self-defense, and I regret that to a certain extent they've achieved it.
All right, Robbie Sabel, Professor of International Law at Hebrew University, thank you very much for coming on and helping us break down this complex issue. A day after the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in Australian history, mourners returned to Bondi Beach, not in fear but in defiance, to light Hanukkah candles and pray for peace. More than 1,000 people gathered at the same Bondi Pavilion, the same location where two terrorists opened fire on a Jewish community celebration just 24 hours earlier, killing at least 15 people and wounding dozens more. Under heavy police security, the crowd lit the Hanukkah candles and recited prayers for the dead, the wounded, and the traumatized Jewish community. Many thousands in Sydney visited the growing memorial of flowers and candles Monday at the site of the attack that became Australia's deadliest shooting in decades.
Feels really vulnerable. It feels like you always hear that on the news. This always happens overseas, happens in Israel, but it never happens to us here. This is supposed to be our safe space, especially Bondi was just most of the most magical, fun areas where it's all about, we're in the silly season, and then suddenly feeling almost betrayed or feeling like it's hard to describe.
Dramatic new footage has emerged from the Bondi attack, showing an elderly couple trying to disarm one of the terrorists. Camera footage from a passerby car shows 69-year-old Boris Gorman struggling with one of the gunmen. Him and his wife Sophia were later shot dead. Australian police have now positively identified both shooters in Sunday's deadly Hanukkah terror attack at Bondi Beach, a father and son duo, 50-year-old Sajid Akram and 24-year-old Naveed Akram. Indian police claim Sajid came originally from the South Indian city of Hyderabad that has a significant Muslim population, and an investigation reveals the two went through some type of military training for the attack in the Philippines in November. Police confirmed the father was shot dead at the scene, while the son is hospitalized in critical but stable condition and is expected to survive and face charges for the shooting spree that claimed at least 15 victims. Australian officials revealed that Naveed Akram was known to the Domestic Intelligence Agency as far back as 2019 over concerns he was accessing extremist material and communicating with radicalized individuals, including a jailed Islamic State terrorist. A 6-month investigation ended with no finding of an immediate threat, and he was removed from watch lists. Police say the father legally owned 6 firearms, obtaining his license in 2015. Authorities found 4 weapons at the scene, additional guns at the rental property, improvised explosive devices in the vehicle, and an Islamic State flag, although conclusions on affiliations remain under investigation. And joining us now is Dr. Sharon Slater, a clinical psychologist for United Hatzalah, part of a mission that was sent to Australia for the Bondi Beach victims. What can you tell us about your purpose there, helping the survivors deal with the trauma of this incident?
We in Israel have a lot of experience with this kind of thing, and supporting trauma survivors in an area of crisis is something that we do in Israel and have done abroad. So our primary mission is to identify the various waves of people in need of our support and visit the hospitals, visit the families, and help them process the unbearable things that they witnessed.
Right. And what type of processing? I mean, how do you do that? You have experience, like you said, in Israel, so many terror survivors. And there were people who were saying that this is a similar process as happened after October 7th for survivors of October 7th. And we know how important that treatment is because there were survivors of that massacre here in Israel who ended up committing suicide. They couldn't deal with the trauma that they went through.
Well, that's an excellent question. And the answer to that is that our purpose is to provide speedy response while the victim of the terrorist attack is still processing, but before they've actually consolidated a story that will wind up becoming a trauma or a post-trauma story. We got on a flight immediately as soon as we heard about the terror attack. We were on a flight the same day, and we arrived as quickly as possible to speak to the victims and try to help them understand what happened, to reframe the narrative of what happened to a more positive narrative so that they can focus on the areas of their experience in which they did have agency, in which they were not helpless, in which they were able to do something, anything to protect themselves. The helplessness and the isolation are two of the factors that we combat when we come into a situation, and we try to enter the situation as soon as possible after the disaster occurs.
And what is your assessment of how people there are dealing with it? Do you feel like they are strong in the face of this adversary, or they are struggling with your personal kind of experience of being on the ground there? Not very long, just.
Right, we landed last night, and I think that your use of the word defiance is actually a really good descriptor for what's going on here. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of sadness and pain. There's the first funeral that's going to be happening tomorrow, a lot of angst over the fact that children were exposed to very, very difficult scenes that they're having trouble processing. Entire families are sleeping in the same room at night because they're afraid to go back to.
We seem to be having some technical difficulty. We can't hear our guest Sharon Slater, so we're gonna say goodbye to our guest there. That was Sharon Slater from United Hatzalah. That's a first aid group here in Israel, voluntary group. They're in Bondi on the ground with the survivors. Now, a word from our sponsors.
As the world moves to boycott Israel, the people working to restore life to the biblical heartland face daily challenges. Blessed by Israel offers a simple way to support these efforts by bringing unique and beautiful products from Judea and Samaria directly to you. From the hilltops of God's land to your home, you can find exceptional items crafted by families and small businesses in the heart of Israel. With US-based warehouses, Blessed by Israel ensures affordable prices and fast delivery. Choose from a range of products, including skincare, artisan flowers and foods, olive oil, tahini, honey, and much more. There are many great options for giving wonderful gifts to your loved ones. Visit blessedbyisrael.com to explore these products and discover the inspiring stories behind them. Scan the QR code on your screen to take part in fulfilling God's prophecies.
And here again, just to show you those dramatic footage of the attempt, another attempt to disarm the attacker of the Bondi terror attack. We know, of course, of Ahmed al-Ahmed, who successfully disarmed one of the terrorists. Here was a prior attempt to do so that failed and could have saved many lives had they succeeded, but that was really a heroic struggle by Boris Gorman and his wife. These are elderly people, 69, 62 years old, trying to disarm the terrorists, but failing to do so, unfortunately, and paying with their lives. That's all for this edition of ILTV on the Hour. You can scan the QR code on your screen for further updates from our ILTV app. I'm Alec Pollard. Thank you very much for watching.